So what we still yet need to talk about is the X-ray tube. That's what we're going to do most of the day. Then we're going to talk about X-ray creation and emissions all at the same time. So chapters 8 and 9 we're going to talk about together. And if you look at chapters 8 and chapter 9, chapter 9 is almost a review of chapter 8. So I'm not real sure why there's a separation between the two. And really, what emission comes down to is if you have your textbook and you're looking at page 137 and 138 and 139, that's really the gist of X-ray emission from the X-ray tube. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about how we change our technical factors and how it affects that elongated bell curve that you're seeing on page 137, 138, 139, and how that affects eventual exposure of the patient to image receptor. So we're going to close the semester with the discussion of that, and we're going to pick up the next semester with kind of a review of that. Because if you can understand that, those things that are on really from pages 137 to 142, how those curves change for their changing technical factors, you can kind of understand imaging a whole lot better. So, but that's not where we're going to be today. We're going to be in the X-ray tube. So in the X-ray tube, in the discussion of the X-ray tube, we're not just going to talk about the tube itself, but we're going to talk about the tube and all the stuff that's connected to the tube. So the support systems, the different types of support systems, we're going to talk about those. We're going to talk about the external components, the things that you see, plus the internal components, the things that you don't see. So we'll take a look at those things again, some of which I've got up here, some I'll have to dig off of the shelf back there, but we'll take a look at each one of those things. So in the X-ray tube, we have external and internal components. The external component, we're going to start all the way with the movement of the X-ray tube. So we have basically three subsets of support systems. We have three sets of support systems and one subset of support systems. So what you're most familiar with is what we refer to as ceiling mounted systems. So if you look in the lab, you walk into the lab, what you see as you walk in the room, and if you're looking, like if you walked in, you laid on a floor and you look straight up at the ceiling, what you would see, some of the room was just a big rectangle, which, it's a rectangle with some features. But what you'll see is a set of rails that are fixed in place that go from one end of the room to the other, right? So they start over close to the window and they go almost to the door, but they're screwed into the ceiling and they don't move. And the amount of steel that goes into holding these things in place is really incredible. So they built this building, and if you've noticed the setup of our room, you probably haven't really paid that much attention, because in clinicals you're just trying to get your feet under you at this point, right? So you haven't really considered the ergonomics of the room all that much. But most of your X-ray rooms, you walk into the room, let's say the door is here, you walk into the room and the bed is over here, right? So that you can pull straight in, you don't have to work around the bed, and then you can push the table, then you can push the patient's bed right up against the table. In our room, it's not quite like that. In our room, it is, the X-ray table is here, right? So if we were to be a true X-ray room where we treated patients, we would have to wheel the stretcher in around the table like that. And it's just not ergonomically correct. We're building the building. This building is about 10 years old. We're building the building. The dean at the time and I came over to look at progress and walked into what would become our X-ray lab, and I look up in the ceiling. They got about $200,000 worth of steel work in the ceiling to support the X-ray tube. I mean, it's a big deal, right? But all of it was at this end of the room over the table where the table was supposed to go. And I said, this is completely backwards. We're gonna have to, it's not a realistic setup. We have to go around the table. And architect or whoever, construction manager, job supervisor, whatever, he's looking up and he says, yeah, I can see what you mean. We could change that, but it's going to take us about 2 months and another $250,000. So that's the reason our room was set up completely backwards, is because, administration was not going to have any part of delaying the construction of the building for that length of time. But all of that goes into supporting this, because X-ray tube is heavy. Well, the tube itself is not heavy, but all the stuff that goes into the tube is heavy, and you don't want it to fall on the patient, right? So there's a lot of stuff that you don't see that goes into the support system. We're not going to really, test on that, but the support system that you can see are these two things that are screwed into all that stuff that's in the ceiling, right? And then you've got another set of rails that run exactly perpendicular to those, and that is what your control tower with your X-ray tube hangs off of. So your X-ray tube is off of that control tower. So the control tower runs on this set of rails, which in turn runs on that set of rails. And in those 4 rails, 2 sets of rails mounted perpendicular to each other, you can move that control tower anywhere in the room. Very flexible. It also gives you the ability to take the X-ray tube and swivel in any direction. You point that X-ray tube in any direction, so that if you were doing, let's say, a surgical lateral hip, you wheel the patient in foot first. You were doing a surgical lateral hip, you could get on this side of the X-ray table and shoot a left surgical lateral hip, right? Or you can put the X-ray tube on the opposite side and shoot a right surgical lateral hip. You could shoot anything that you wanted to in that X-ray room. Most flexible ceiling mounted systems. Okay. But they're also, because of all that superstructure that you have to have, they're very expensive to create. And these, typically tend to be your higher end X-ray units. So, doctor's offices, doctors make a lot of money, but $250,000 worth of X-ray room, $250,000 worth of support system to hold the X-ray room up, plus a building tall enough to support all that stuff, it's just not feasible for most doctors. So what they'll have is what they refer to as a ceiling to floor mounted system, and you might have seen these in your doctor's office. So if you go into just a doctor's office and you have an X-ray of, you sprained your wrist or whatever, they take an X-ray, what you'll see is this system that runs on a track on the floor, and it's also got a track on the ceiling, and you've got this big arm or big stand that goes in between the two, and it can run up and down on those rails. Then the X-ray tube is suspended from an arm that sticks out from that. So the table would be down here, right? So your movement is pretty much limited to this, plus you can swivel the arm so that you can take an X-ray on the wall, right? You can do some pivoting in this direction, but it's very limited, right? So they're a whole lot cheaper. This is where you're going to probably see some of your single phase machines. We said you could identify single phase machines by the presence of the line voltage compensation circuit being visible on the control panel, but also by the timers, right? The timers were going to be in increments of 1/122nd. There is a subset of that, which is just a floor mounted system, and those are kind of wonky. That's what we used to have over in the Pearl building before we built this one. And the problem with this one is sometimes it'll hop track. So, there were at least 2 incidences that I can remember where, because I used to be a lab instructor, and 2 incidents that I can remember. I heard a loud crash, and I walk in, this thing's laying on the floor. Unfortunately, nobody got up under it because it's heavy, but it jumped the track, and it, so we had to stand it back up, which again is heavy. I had to stand it back up, put it back on track. So that's just floor mounted system. And the other system is kind of a ceiling mounted system, but the X-ray tube and the image receptor are in one contained unit, and that's what we refer to as C-arm or even a U-arm setup. So we added we're in the process of adding another clinical site that should go active for the spring semester, and that is Azalea Orthopedic, and you'll see something like that over there. C-arms, also we use them in portable fluoroscopy. If you've ever been back to special procedures, interventional, they use a C-arm system as well. There's this fluoroscopy. What you're going to see over at Azalea is not fluoroscopy. It's just diagnostic. So those are your support systems. You have ceiling to floor mounted, and C-arm system. And then the X-ray tube that you see, you don't really see the X-ray tube. You see what we refer to as protective housing. So protective housing does a lot of stuff. It holds the X-ray tube inside of it, and it protects you from stray X-rays in as much as it can, but it also protects the X-ray tube against you as well. You know, sometimes you get your fingers off the buttons a little bit too quick and the X-ray tube comes to a sudden stop, right? And some of that rough handling sometimes can damage the X-ray tube. So the protective housing is supposed to help protect against that. Plus, let's say you're doing a sunrise patella, right? And you rotate the X-ray tube up and you're dropping it down, you're paying attention to the patient's anatomy instead of paying attention to where the table is. You ran the X-ray tube into the table. If that was just a glass X-ray tube, you'd break the X-ray tube, right? So it protects you from the tube, but it also protects the tube from you. So what we have then is protective housing, and inside the protective housing, you've got the X-ray tube. So the protective housing is what you can visualize. It's got those big fat cables coming out of it. And what we have inside of that is not just the X-ray tube, but some other stuff as well. Okay? So protective housing, it contains oil, right? So the main thing that kills the X-ray tube, limits X-ray tube life, is heat. So we've been through that, and we're going to touch on some of the other ways that that's going to happen today. But one is just buildup of heat, right? So because we're going to run a lot of electricity through the X-ray tube, anytime we send electricity through a circuit, we're going to create two things. That's a magnetic field, and the second is heat, right? So the creation of X-rays is just conversion from electric energy into electromagnetic energy, right? So inside of the X-ray tube, we've got the cathode and we've got the anode. So the cathode is the negative side, the anode is positive side. The cathode's just filament, and we're going to run a current through the filament until we get to a point where we're bowling off electrons, and that is what we refer to as thermionic emissions. Thermionic create hot ions, right? So it's just electrons. They're very hot. And that's one of the ways we're going to limit the life of the X-ray tube is creating the heat. We're going to create the heat here. We're going to deposit it over here on the anode. And so we got heat, right? So we got to deal with that heat. We talked about the different ways we can dissipate heat. One was convection. I thought you said conviction. I was like, no, that's you're in class here. That's over in parole. That's legal. Convection, right? Convection is blowing, right? So anybody drinking coffee or hot chocolate, it's kind of cold outside, and it's too hot. You blow across it, and that's convection. You're removing some of the heat by moving of molecules. Okay, so inside of the tube housing, the part of what the tube housing protects against is that buildup of heat that's going to kill the X-ray tube. So inside of the tube housing, you're going to have some sort of mechanism that's going to do just that. So you've got areas where there may not be any fluid, but the fluid may get hot and thermally radiate some heat, And then what you've got is a fan type thing that's going to blow some of that heat. It's going to suck some air in from outside. X-ray room is usually pretty cool. It's going to blow it across that heat, and it's going to remove the heat back into the room. Okay, so it's convection. What else do we have? I said one just a second ago. Thermal radiation. Right. So thermal radiation, the first place we're going to see thermal radiation is that we have the heat here, and we're going to get thermal radiation off of it. We deposit the heat here, and we're going to have thermal radiation off of that as well. But also, our area of bombardment on the anode, so now we've turned this so that we're looking straight at it. The area of bombardment is going to be very small, a little bitty area, measured in millimeters. So the heat, though, does not just stay in that one spot. First off, we're going to rotate this around and around, which is going to spread the heat out all the way around that, but it's also going to spread that way, which is spread by touching, which we refer to as conduction, right? So thermal radiation, conduction, thermal radiation, convection. We got all three of those things going on inside of the housing. And of course, we've got the oil inside that we're going to also conduct the heat into and then, convect it off of. Right? So all of those things are going on inside of your housing. The fan might not truly be a fan. It may be what they refer to as a bellows type apparatus. So what that does is as the air heats up, it kind of compresses a bellows. A bellows is one of those things that you can stoke fire up with, right? It goes, right? I don't know what I'm talking about. So it compresses as the air rises and it pushes the air out. But as things cool, it reinflates or re-deflates, reinflates, sucking cool air back into it. So then on your next exposure, it pushes it back out again. Okay. So if you see something about bellows, that's what it's referring to. It's not an active fan. It's a bellows type system that works as a fan. So where we have X-ray impact on our anode, our X-ray creation is such that the X-rays try to go off in all different directions with equal intensity. So try to imagine that being three-dimensional instead of two-dimensional. So what that means is X-rays are trying to go all of these ways, but they're also trying to go all of those ways too, right? So it's three-dimensional. And we have a word that refers to that. Equal intensity in all directions means isotropic, or the word for it is isotropic emissions. That's at the base of the anode. Realistically, the X-rays that are trying to go straight through the anode are going to have a hard time because it's going to be, heavy metal. So they're going to have a hard time going through it. But at the point of impact, you've got isotropic emissions. The X-ray tube itself has what we refer to as a window. So I've got a couple of videos on YouTube. Biomed guy used to work at ETMC, passed away, kind of young. He passed away a few years ago. He sent me some images or some videos where he took the collimator housing off so that you could see up into the X-ray tube, and you could actually see, the electrons jump up from cathode to anode. You can't really see it because, it's a blink of an eye, but you can see the glow, right? It starts to glow a little bit, and then whenever he's on the prep button, and then whenever he hits exposure, there's an actual flash. So the only reason that you can see that is because there's a glass window in the housing. Okay. Otherwise, you can't see that. If your patient says that they could, I know the X-ray took because I saw the flash. No, they did not. Because you're never going to shoot the patient without the collimator housing on. That's the only way that they would see it. So the purpose, one of the purposes for the protective housing, aside from cooling and the X-ray tube protection against, rough handling, is to limit that isotropic emissions to what comes through the window, and that's what we refer to as the useful beam. Okay, so now this is the useful beam. Even still, though, we got to have that collimator housing to protect against a few things as well. We'll get to that. Okay, so limit to the useful beam through the window. The other thing that it does is it limits leakage radiation. What's the distinguishing characteristic of X-rays over visible light? What do they do?
Radiation.
Okay, they're both radiation, but visible light
refract or bounce or I don't know, something in that area, right?
penetrate.
Penetrate.
They penetrate. X-rays penetrate things that light won't. Right? I mean, can you see my eyes? Oh, can't. Because visible light just doesn't go through, solid matter very well. So X-rays with that isotropic emission are going to try to go through pretty much everything in every possible direction, right? We want to limit it to the useful beam, but some may get out somewhere else, and that's what we refer to as leakage radiation. Okay, so all your X-ray tubes are going to have some degree of leakage radiation. So, just because, let's say you're taking a portable on a patient, you're standing behind the X-ray tube, and the X-ray tube is pointed that direction, you're standing behind it, does not mean that you're not getting exposed. Okay, because there is leakage radiation. There's actually an allowable amount of leakage radiation. If you look on page 115, at the bottom of the page, the last sentence says that the protective housing should limit leakage radiation to 1 milligrade per hour at 1 meter. So even if you're standing, 3 feet away from the X-ray tube, you're getting hit, right? So should you be standing just behind an X-ray tube thinking that you're safe? Answer is no. So still use your, time, distance, shielding. Get out of the room, get away from the X-ray tube, even if the X-ray tube is pointing away from you, because you're getting leakage radiation. All right, so it limits leakage radiation. It limits X-ray beam to the useful beam, or the X-rays to the useful beam through the port. Inside the protective housing, you've got all this stuff to help cool it, but also the oil, it helps with not just the heat, but also as an electric insulator. So it does a lot of stuff. Protects you against the X-ray tube, but also protects the X-ray tube against you. Maybe make sure I didn't miss anything and all that I wanted to cover. And I did not. All right. So I'm going to pass the X-ray tube around, then I'm going to pass around individual components again. Remember what I said about the X-ray tube? We can't replace it. It's a vacuum tube. If you drop it and you break it, it's going to sound like a bomb went off from here. So, a few things before I pass it around, things I want you to pay attention to, is that if you can rotate this thing around to where you can see the cathode. A cathode is the part that does not rotate. All right. So what you're going to see is, you're not going to cooperate at all. You see, can you kind of see that little dot right there? Mm-hmm. Okay. So keep your eye on that dot and just kind of rotate this thing around. And what you'll find is that this thing is so well balanced that with just the slightest amount of movement, the X-ray tube will swivel, it'll pivot, it'll rotate, right? So it doesn't take a whole lot. So it's well balanced, and also it has to rotate on things. So we'll talk about that here in a bit. But also look at the cathode, and you'll have to look at the cathode pretty much from the opposite side of the X-ray tube. And you can't really see everything that's going on, but what you'll see is this V-shaped thing, okay? So inside that V-shaped thing, you got two filaments. I'll pass a cathode around so you can see the individual filaments on that too. But we're going to talk about that V-shaped thing as well. And then certainly look at the anode and the bevel on the anode. What you'll see is it's not just flat like what I've drawn up here, but it's got a little bit of angulation on it. Then finally look at the back side of the anode. It looks different from the front side. So we're going to talk about all that stuff. So I'm going to pass this around. And once you eyeball that, this is the cathode. Pass that around. All right, so inside the X-ray tube, or the X-ray tube itself, what we call the thing that holds the vacuum in is an envelope. All right, I'm not 100% sure why. The tube, to me, is better, or at least just as good. But anyway, the tube itself, the glass itself, is what we refer to as an envelope. So inside the envelope, we have cathode, we have the anode, and we'll talk about the individual components of that. But the purpose for that glass is to hold a vacuum. Originally, they used partially pressurized X-ray tubes, and that pressurization, the molecules inside that pressurization interfered with the travel of the electrons from cathode to anode. So they started using a vacuum tube, and the X-ray production increased and it got better. We can lose part or all of that vacuum, and what happens is we get vaporization of whatever gets inside of there, and what we then have is what we refer to as a gassy tube, and we get erratic exposures that are unpredictable. So maintaining that vacuum is very, very important. And that's what glass does. Sometimes we'll use a metal envelope instead of a glass envelope. And here's why. All right. So when we make exposures over time, and I think we've talked about this, we've got an X-ray tube, right? We got anode and we got cathode. But over time, the more we use our X-ray tube, the more this thing is going to melt. This is made of tungsten. This is also made of tungsten, but this is made of tungsten as well for a couple of different reasons. One is that it has a very high melting point. It's like 3,400 degrees Celsius before it melts, but it does melt eventually. It's just like a light bulb. Light bulb, the filament's made of tungsten as well, and your light bulbs don't last forever, right? Incandescent light bulbs are the ones that get hot. You turn them on and then you can't reach up and touch them, right? And they're getting to be more and more rare, but they still are out there. They eventually burn out. Whenever you unscrew them, you take a look at them, and what you see is around the base of the light bulb. What happens is that you've got what we would refer to as an open filament. So you've got that thing, an open filament just means it's burned out. But whenever you take the light bulb out, what you'll see is this area right around the base gets dark, and that's because that thing eventually is going to melt. And as it melts, it coats the inside of the light bulb. And the same thing happens with the X-ray tube. That's eventually going to melt. And eventually will burn out. But as it melts, what we'll get is a layer of metal on the inside of the glass. Okay? Thinking back to electricity. Is glass a good insulator or conductor?
Insulator.
It's good insulator. It's good insulator. What about metal?
Conductor.
What about glass that's coated with metal? It's also going to be a conductor, right? So the X-ray tube, that X-ray tube that I don't think has ever been used, looking at just everything on the X-ray tube, I don't know, maybe it just didn't work. But I don't think that one was ever used, not for a single exposure. So the glass is pure. It's Pyrex glass, Pyrex high heat glass. It has none of that going on, right? It's just glass. So there is no electrical conductivity between here and here. But what if we coat that thick enough? Might it change the electric character, the conductivity characteristics of the X-ray tube. Might those electrons travel instead of from here to here, then go from here to here?
Yes.
Answer is yeah. Right? Electricity, like water, follows path of least resistance. So if there's less, if it takes less effort for the electrons to go from here to here than here to here, then what you get is what we call arcing. And arcing occurs because with tube life, we're going to melt the filament. It's going to coat the inside of the X-ray tube. Let's do this. Miniature lightning bolts, right? That's your arcing. This is what we refer to as tanning. Okay? It's tanning of the X-ray tube. Just like, you lay under the sun, you're tanning. Tanning of the X-ray tube occurs as the tube gets older because we melt the filament, possibly a portion of the anode as well, coats the inside of the X-ray tube, changes the imaging characteristics of the X-ray tube, and then eventually leads to arcing. Most common cause of instant tube failure. You're clicking along, just making exposure after exposure and after exposure, and then you hear something weird come out of your X-ray tube and you can't make any more exposures. That's what happened, most likely. Okay, arcing. Because of tanning because of heat, right? So,
So that's the most common cause of what X-ray tube failures.
yeah, it's the most common cause of instant tube failure.
Okay.
So we've got a lot of different causes for tube failure, but that's one of them. Certainly, we could have an open filament, just burn one of them out, and we don't have an arcing issue there. Now, again, the tube that's coming around is a glass, has a glass envelope, right? But the book says that they also have metal envelope. So that would seem like this would be an issue right away with metal envelope, wouldn't it?
No.
Well, yes, is the answer. If they build the metal envelope, if they make the metal envelope where, the metal is close enough to the travel of the electrons that it prefers this direction to that direction, you're going to have a problem. Okay? But if they make the envelope, if they engineer the envelope, maybe they make this distance a little bit further, maybe that's how they overcome it. But if they make that distance a little bit further and this whole thing is metal and they can build this envelope to where the flow of electrons ignores that metal down there, is laying down another thin layer of metal really going to affect it all that much?
No.
Answer is no. No, it's not. So the benefit of a metal envelope is that it removes the possibility of tanning. Well, it doesn't remove the possibility of tanning. Tanning's still going to happen. It's going to remove the possibility of arcing due to tanning. Okay, so some of your X-ray tubes is going to be metal. We've got one up there, this glass, and it's got, this thing around it. It's not really a metal envelope. That's just oil, right? That's a part of the cooling mechanism. But anyway, just file that away. I think most of the tubes that you're going to see are probably going to be glass, but in case there's a test question all the way through the registry, what's the benefit of a metal envelope?
Takes away tanning.
The tanning's still going to happen, but the arcing is not, right? So the tube life, you got longer tube life. Okay. So the internal components then become really what you got?
So if they break a tube, is it really just replacing it? No, any real repairing really?
No,
It's just replacing.
Yeah.
Way because it's a vacuum and
Right. So if it loses vacuum, you get a gassy tube, it's a new tube. If you burn out the filament, it's a new tube. You got arcing, it's a new tube. Other things, the rotor has to rotate on something. So if those bearings that it rotates on wear out, it's a new tube. So they can't get inside and repair anything. It's just brand new tube. And other things are expensive, you know, diagnostic tubes are easily $10,000.
One of the portables that pretty sure they blew up too. There's something wrong with it.
Oh, yeah.
I was curious.
So it won't shoot?
No, so right.
Yeah.
What do you think? Okay.
Sometimes, like your portables, most of the time your portables just going to have one filament, but some of your okay, so this is getting into the internal components. With cathode, you have two filaments. So as it's coming around, you should be able to look down and see you've got two filaments. One's big, and by big, I mean it's that big as opposed to small, is much smaller, shorter. And the purpose for those is that if you're making exposure on extremity work where you want to see the detail, you use small filament. So think of like fluorescent lights. We've got fluorescent lights in here. Hold your hands over your desk and what does your shadow look like? Garbage.
Yeah.
Pretty much. Okay. So then my battery is just about done. All right. So what does my shadow look like from this one? Yeah. It's not fuzzy, right? If you can see it. Can you hit the bottom button? Better? Yeah. So small filament, fluorescent lights, large filament, right? So detail on the small filament. And, you know, if you're making large exposures, go ahead and hit the top one again. Or Zoe would fall back to sleep on me. So if you're making exposures with, you know, high exposures, we want to use that large filament. And as a matter of fact, if you try to select small filament with a high MA station, it's going to give you a tube overload. So where I was going with all this, with the, you know, the burnout X-ray tube, is that you can kind of diagnose X-ray tubes sometimes. You know, if you got a machine that gives you tube overload light, and you're setting a technique of maybe 60 kVp at 100 MA station with a low time, and it's still giving you tube overload on either large or small filament, just individually one at a tube, that filament's burnt out, right? If it'll allow you to make the exposure on the other filament, that's definitive proof you got a burnout filament. So, and then again, unless you know your radiologist are okay with that single other filament, that's another tube replacement. Okay, everybody good with all this? Benefit to a metal tube is no arcing, right? So the one other thing that I haven't mentioned about what the protective housing with the collimator housing attached to it provides is filtration. All right. So remembering back to chapter 1, Rollins developed filtration, and his purpose for developing filtration was to reduce patient dose, remove those X-ray photons, just going to absorb inside of the patient, do nothing except for drop patient dose. So, you know, they had to come to a happy medium with how much filtration was good, right? So what they've landed on is that if you're using a machine that creates X-rays at 70 kVp or above, you have to have 2.5 millimeters of aluminum equivalent. The equivalent's a big word in this. It has to be 2.5 millimeters of aluminum equivalent filtration. So what that means is that as the X-ray beam goes through the glass, remembering that nothing is radioparent, it's right, it's radiolucent, it's going to absorb some of those low energy X-ray photons. It's going to absorb some here as well in the oil. It's going to absorb some in this glass. It's going to absorb some, remembering that we've got a mirror, right? A mirror inside of the collimator housing. The backside of that mirror is probably going to be silver, and it's going to absorb some. And if all that stuff, is everybody saying the tube?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So, don't worry about it.
Yeah. It's-
Oh, yeah. So if all of that stuff that the X-ray beam has to go through before it gets to the patient is the equivalent of 2.5 millimeters of aluminum in its density, then you're good. Right? You can make exposure on, people. But if it doesn't, then we have to have more filtration added to it. So we have two different types of filtration. This is kind of getting out of order for the lecture, but we have two different types of filtration. One is what we refer to as inherent filtration. And inherent filtration for our purposes is going to be filtration that you have to have in order to make an exposure on a human being. Okay? So that's 2.5 millimeters of aluminum. You can't make an exposure with, diagnostic exposure without it. Added filtration will be anything above 2.5. So if we were to use a scoliosis series, we talk about the trough filters that they might use for scoliosis. That's added filtration. Okay. Now here's the kind of a kicker. What is tanning? Let's take the X off tanning, because tanning always happens. Brand new X-ray tube system has 2.5 millimeters of aluminum equivalent. So what is tanning? Specifically, what is it?
It's the coating,
It's coating of
the burnt filament.
burnt filament, which is made of tungsten, which is metal, which is radio opaque, which means it's going to absorb some of the X-rays before it comes out of the X-ray tube. So is that added filtration or is it inherent?
Added. And here,
The answer is yes.
Oh.
The answer is yes, it is. It is. It's added inherent. Okay. So we're going to amend our definition to not just 2.5 millimeters of aluminum, because that's what you got to have in order to make an exposure on a person, but you can't remove it from the system. So two things there. You can't remove it from the system, and you have to have it to legally make an X-ray. So it's increased, if that is a better word to kind of sink it in, it's increased inherent filtration. Again, you can't get inside of the X-ray tube and scrub it out. It's going to be there forever until you get to a point of arcing or something else kills the X-ray tube. Okay.
so added inherent as just tanning.
Yeah, that's the only thing that's going to be an added inherent is tanning. Everything that you add below the collimator housing is truly added, just added. So you may see it, and test question is increased inherent, or it adds inherent. Okay. Okay, so back to the internal components. You got cathode, that's negative end of the X-ray tube. That's where the filament lies. But did you notice that the filaments, there was two, the filaments were kind of backed off inside that V-shaped thing? Did you notice that? Okay, we're going to call that V-shaped thing a focusing cup. And what it does is that it compresses the electrons before we send the electrons across the tube. So because all of the electrons are negative, all of them the same charge, and we know that like charges repel, then what's going to happen is as we apply the KVP, if they're already pushing each other apart, once we hit the KVP, the electrons are going to try to go all over the place, right? Again, it's like dropping a bowling ball in a mud puddle. They're just going to go everywhere. So the focusing cup surrounds the filament on all sides except for one, so that what we do is we apply a negative charge to the focusing cup to keep the electrons compressed in as much as we can, so that when we send them across the tube, we create our thermionic emissions, create our space charge, we send them across the X-ray tube, they can't spread out nearly as much. So they're going to impact just where we want them to impact on the target area. So if the focusing cup fails, then we're back to that situation where the electrons go everywhere. Now, the purpose for that is just like the purpose for the large and the small filament. So if we have large filament and we send the electrons across the tube, they're going to interact in a large place on the anode, right? So we got fluorescent lights. If our focusing cup fails, it's even bigger. And again, we've got even bigger fluorescent lights. If though we use the focusing cup and we press them together, and especially if we use small filament, now we've got something more like incandescent lights and we can bring out sharpness or recorded detail. Focusing cup. Purpose for the function of the focusing cup is we apply negative charge to it. All those are negative too, and it's kind of like compressing, everybody's direct to yard, right? It's kind of like compressing leaves in a bag, right? It's just cramming the leaves together, right? To make it a tighter collection of electrons before we send them across the tube, so that they impact a smaller area on the anode and bring up sharpness recorded detail. Okay, so that's one of the few ways that your tube theoretically could die that might not be directly related to heat, is that you just may lose electrical connection to your focusing cup somehow or another, right? You lose sharpness recorded detail, that very well could be the issue. Okay, so in the cathode, we've got two filaments, big one for big exposures, little one for sharpness recorded detail, both inside of the focusing cup. Purpose for the focusing cup, compress the stream of electrons so they impact a smaller area on the face of the target, increase the sharpness recorded detail. Okay. The big and little, the big one, the large focal spot, the large filament is for large exposures. So if you're taking a KUB on a patient, you would want to naturally use large focal spot, because KUB is going to be large exposure, and plus you're just not going to see a whole lot of detail in a KUB. Small would be for like extremity work, skull work. You're looking for fine bony detail, trabecular markings, things like that. Okay. So here's a couple of questions on that are specific to filament size that you may run into. All right. So most of your X-ray tubes are going to not allow you to make exposure on small filament above 200 MA because it's small filament. All right. So small filament, you put too many electrons on it, you pop your filament. Right. You burn it out too quickly. So most of your tubes are going to limit you to 200 MA or below for small filament. Okay, so you can shoot with any MA station on large filament, though. All right. So here's the thing: what is mass?
Quantity times time.
Yeah, it's quantity times MA times time, right? So it's overall mass. It's just a count of electrons. That's all it is. So what's going to be the difference in a 100 MA or a 100 mass exposure on small filament and a 100 mass exposure on large filament? Are you going to have a difference in image receptor exposure between those two?
No.
The answer is no. 100 mass is 100 mass, regardless of where it's coming from. Right? All right. So the thing is, people sometimes on test questions will kind of confuse those two things. If your machine will allow you to make the same exposure on large filament and small filament, the output should be identical. 100 mass is 100 mass. But if you try to use 300 MA to get to that 100 mass on a small filament, it's not going to let you make that exposure. That's a totally different thing. Okay, you get that's the difference between 100 mass and no exposure at all, right? But if it allows you to make that exposure, there should be no difference in output regardless of which filament you use. Okay. Okay. So what's it made of? Well, it's made of tungsten primarily because it a couple of different reasons. One is it's good for thermionic emissions, but another thing, both of them, you know, the filament and the target are made of tungsten. But one of the other reasons it's made out of tungsten is because tungsten is kind of, I won't say completely unique, but it is unique enough that it doesn't behave like some other things, right? So in summertime, how do your rings fit? Providing you wear rings. Hopefully not too tight, right? But you go swimming in cold water and what happens to your hands? It might fall off, right? Wintertime, kind of shrink up, right? You take a balloon, you blow up a balloon, try this at home sometime. Take a balloon, blow up a balloon, stick it in a refrigerator, come back in 20 minutes. What do you think it's going to look like? It's going to be deflated, right? It's not because that you've lost molecules. You can take it back out, let it heat back up, it'll reinflate. Okay, so heat and cold affect different things. So you get shrinkage in cold stuff, and then you get expansion in hot stuff, right? So what you don't want, because we're imaging, people, what we don't want is that to happen with our filament. So tungsten has a semi-unique ability to maintain its shape regardless of how hot or cold it gets. Okay, it doesn't distort well. It doesn't distort much at all. Problem with tungsten, though, anybody ever dealt with tungsten? Welding, TIG welding or anything like that? Anybody got a tungsten ring? Because that's been kind of a thing, in the last few years. Nobody has tungsten ring. Your husband does. Okay. Tell them to be careful with it. If it's pure tungsten, it's fragile. Chances are it's an alloy. It's not pure tungsten, because if it is, has he ever dropped it? If it was pure tungsten, he dropped it, chances are it's shattered. Okay. So we don't use pure tungsten in either one of those for those reasons. We want the good thermonic emissions. We want it to not distort, but it's so fragile that if you bang around your X-ray tube, you very well could break that because it's fragile. So we put a little bit of thorium in the filament. We use tungsten in the target for the same reasons, sort of. We don't want thermonic emission, but we do want conductivity and high melting point, right? So we're going to put a little bit of rhenium in the target to help it not shatter, from rough handling. Now, did you notice the backside, though, of the target as it came around? Kind of looked like plastic back there, didn't it? That's not plastic, because plastic can melt. But what it probably is in that X-ray tube, being as dark as this, is probably graphite, a graphite backing. So sometimes they'll use a graphite backing on, so the entire disc, or at least the focal track, will be primarily tungsten, but maybe we've got a backing that's made out of something different. Graphite is very light, so it makes it easier to rotate. It's also, it conducts heat less. Okay. That might have kind of made you mentally slam on the brakes, right? Because what did we want? We wanted 3 different types of heat dispersion. We wanted convection, conduction, thermal radiation. Right, so we got thermal radiation, we got the convection up here, but what we want to do is we want to stop the conduction before it goes down this way. And a reason for that is this has to rotate on something. So we've got bearings back here, okay, and they're oiled, they're well greased, and you saw how well it rotated, right? It just rotates, takes almost nothing to make it rotate. So we've got these bearings and they're well greased, but as they get hot, that grease wear out. Anybody ever heard a car that's got, worn wheel bearings? Ever pull up to a stop sign or stoplight and somebody pulls up beside you and it just sounds like somebody's grinding on something? One of 2 things. It's awful, right? But that's one of 2 things. Either the brakes are blown, the brakes are just completely worn out, or they've got worn out wheel bearings. You're in contact with the road plus all that friction and rotating around. your bearings are going to wear out eventually. All right. So how you can tell the difference between the two is if they take off from the red light and you don't hear that grinding sound, it's their brakes. But if you still hear it, their wheel bearings are blown. All right. So same thing is going to happen here because of the heat. If the heat, we're going to create heat and they're going to get hot, but we want to try to stop the heat from going down the stem and getting to those bearings as much as we can. Okay, it's still going to get hot because it's still inside of all this, but we want to prevent at least that portion of the heat. Okay, because if they get hot enough and they lose that lubrication, then what's eventually going to happen is they're going to wear out. They may weld themselves together, and now you got a stationary anode. Well, what was the purpose for rotating the anode?
To disperse heat.
Dissipation of heat, right? So if now we've got a stationary anode, we don't dissipate the heat very well. And again, we're back to a situation where the heat's going to kill the X-ray tube. Okay. All right. So again, internal components of cathodes, negative side, you got two filaments. Purpose for the two filaments, make sure you keep those straight. It's our source of thermonic emissions. Made of tungsten, primarily. Oh, a couple of things. All right, so I want you to look at a couple of things that almost look like they say the same thing. Cathode. Okay. So if you look at the bottom of page 117, let's talk about thermonic emissions. All right, so thermonic emissions, you apply the MA, you press your prep button, you heat the filament up, you get to the point of thermonic emissions, you got a lot of hot ions. Is there a possibility that you try to put too many electrons or more electrons on the filament than the filament can possibly hold?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah. You might not burn out the filament, but yeah, you can only put so much water in your cup, right? And then it just overflows and you can't fill your cup up anymore. So this is what you got. So the cloud of electrons, called space charge, makes it difficult for subsequent electrons to be emitted by the filament because of the electrostatic propulsion. So what you've got there is a lot of electrons bumping into each other, trying to bump into each other, pushing each other apart. You got a limited space, right, to put them. So you can only put so many on it before you can't put any more on it. Your cup is full, right? So then it goes on to say this phenomenon is called the space charge effect. Space charge effect means that you've got as much MA going through that filament as you can possibly put onto the filament. So how can you get some of those off of the filament then? Well, you're in prep stage. Where do they go once you hit exposure?
See.
Across the tube, right? So can you put more on it after that?
Yeah.
Answer is yes, but can you then have a high enough MA that you can't resupply enough electrons to bring it back up to maximum current? And the answer is yes. And so if you flip the page, that's what you refer to as saturation current. Okay. So space charge effect is before exposure. Saturation current means that's tube current. You can't get the exposure you want because you just don't have a big enough filament. You don't have a high enough MA. You can't give it any more electrons. Again, we're back to Scotty from Star Trek. Give it a roll of gut, Captain. And you got nothing else. It's maximum tube current. Saturation current. Okay. So space charge effect before exposure, saturation current is actual tube current. You just let's finish up the anode, and then we'll call it good. It's still a lot on the anode. Some of it we've already talked about though. Remember this hour, 15 minutes course. And the reason I pull up early in a lot of cases is because you're at saturation current. All right, so we talked about the anode and what it is, so we're going to skip through that. we do have two possible types of anode. We've got a rotating anode. That's what you're going to use, rotating anode. You're never going to work with a stationary anode unless you work in a dental office. Low exposure, low heat creation, you can use stationary anode. You're never going to work with one of those. So the target area is just the area of bombardment. Again, if I draw the face of the anode, let's say the area of bombardment is your target, okay? So since we rotate it, though, the target area always moves. It always changes. And that entire area is what we refer to as the focal tract. Okay? So the area of bombardment is, let's see, the focal tract, and we'll do this. All that is the focal tract. This area of bombardment is the target area. Okay? So the anode, again, is made out of tungsten, but if you look on page 119, we've got some different reasons for it. Conductivity, the atomic number, the importance of the atomic number in this case is kind of getting into the next section with X-ray emission. How do we create X-rays? Two different ways. Brims, exactly. So what does brims rely on? As it goes around the nucleus, exactly. Okay, so if that nuclear field, a large nuclear field is necessary to make it lose some of that, then doesn't it kind of make sense that we want a big nucleus with a strong nuclear field? The answer is yeah. So we're going to use tungsten because it's got a large nucleus, but also with that large nucleus, what's the binding energies of the inner shell electrons? The closer you get your electrons to the nucleus of the atom, what happens with binding energy? It increases, right? So the inner shell binding energy of a tungsten atom is at 69.5. Okay, so if we can eject one of those inner shell electrons and replace it with a non-bound electron, we get a high energy characteristic X-ray photon, right? So tungsten, we're going to use it for, its atomic number, essentially for those two reasons, but we're also going to use it because it takes a lot to melt it and it conducts heat quite well. So we can also use, the rotation of the anode helps us to dissipate some of that heat. We can also use a larger anode, a larger disk, to further dissipate the heat. We can also rotate it faster and faster, right? So some of your, like CT X-ray tubes and special procedures X-ray tubes use a very large disk and it rotates at something like 10,000 RPMs. Ours is at about 3,000 RPMs, but high exposure areas like special procedures, cardiac cath lab, things like that may use specialty tubes that rotate faster, larger disks, and the purpose for that is just to dissipate more heat because they create more heat. Okay. Okay, I'm gonna stop torturing you. The looks are just like, I can't take it more. I can't take this up. I started to do this before I got into that last portion. I was like, I can handle a little bit more. No, you cannot. All right. All right. So whatever we don't get to, I'll report and leave. By the time we get to the end of this.